Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to Explain. Today, I'm going to be, explaining another underappreciated tool in the process of music creation, the studio reference monitor. We're talking about some of the things that separate a speaker like this from your run-of-the-mill car stereo or home system. We'll be talking about some factors that separate studio monitors from each other and some important specifications that you should consider when buying new or trying to optimize for your current setup, depending on what monitors you have and your acoustic space. We're going to be doing a bit of a minor case study between some monitors that I recently upgraded to and the ones that I was using previously. Though it won't be entirely scientific, it should provide a good, at least anecdote as to why you might consider getting something in a higher price range or larger speakers or something that has more adaptability to your setup. So with that, let's discuss some of the fundamentals when it comes to studio reference monitors. And a lot of this vocabulary is probably going to sound familiar to those of you that are already knowledgeable about FR systems or full range flat response, because in essence, a studio monitor should be both full range and flat response. That's a term that usually us guitarists use in the context of amp modeling. Say you want to play a Line 6 Helix or an Acoustics or a Kemper or whatever you have out loud, but you don't want to use a guitar speaker system like the cabinets that I have in this room. You would usually go for an FR system. Now, what that means is that it covers the entire audible frequency spectrum, generally between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, or even below and above if they're particularly good. And throughout that entire audible frequency spectrum, the frequency response is flat response, meaning that there's no, huge peaks or troughs or notches that really fundamentally change the sound that is going into the speaker system. This is different from your car stereo or a portable Bluetooth speaker, or especially that aforementioned guitar speaker cabinet example, because almost without exception, none of these examples are full range or flat response. A lot of the times car stereos, people like to dial them in to have this smiley face EQ curve that completely buries the mids and becomes overwhelming with the bass and treble side of things to the point it sounds shrill and basically buries all the guitars and vocals, and I can't stand it. Then you have, a lot of these portable speakers are kind of boxy and quacky sounding unless you most of the time pay over a certain price range. And then, guitar players already know that speakers like this cut off a lot of that bass end, sometimes, all the way past like 120 hertz. Most of the time you've got kind of a little bump in those vocal 1,000 to 3,000 hertz regions. And then about after 4 to 5K, completely chops off the entire frequency response. So, none of these things are going to be very helpful for mixing music. You see, no matter where you're at in the music creation process, whether you're miking up a full orchestra or making adjustments to electric guitar tone or simply cutting frequencies in a mix, you want to be sure that all of those changes are going to be faithfully replicated no matter what kind of product your customer is listening through. And that's a hard thing to do because we're talking about speakers that range from $5 budget headphones to multi-$1,000 home stereo systems. And so the only way to be sure that what they're hearing is the intended mix, the only way that you can make sure that no matter if they have the bass cranked in their car or they're listening through a Bluetooth speaker, that your music sounds the way that you intend it to, is kind of listen through a blank slate yourself. And that's where studio reference monitors come in. I kind of think of these things as a scale. If you have a properly calibrated scale and you put an object that weighs exactly 1.0000 kilograms on it, you should get 1.0000 plus or minus a little bit of error kilograms. And that's kind of what these things do in the audio world. Kind of the same thing as, if you have a content creation centric monitor, you should have a specific range of colors that it can reproduce. That way, no matter what screen you're viewing on, you will be able to accurately replicate those colors. So it's the same thing in audio. Now, the funny thing about the studio reference monitor naming and with other FR systems in general is that it kind of implies they should all sound the same, right? I mean, it's achieved this mythical reference scale-like designation. So, that means that No matter if you're listening through a 3-inch monitor or an 8-inch monitor or one from Yamaha or Mackie, they should, cover the full frequency spectrum and they should be flat, right? Well, the truth is they're not. And besides those differences, you'll run into feature set exclusivities, depending on what SKU you're looking at, what brand, that help to compensate for some of those imperfections, whether they be in the speaker, the enclosure, or even the acoustic space that you're listening to them in. So let's cover some of those things that you should keep an eye out for, especially if you're buying one new. For starters, essentially all of these reference monitors that fall into this kind of prosumer category that I'm discussing today aren't actually full range. Both of the sets we're looking at here do extend their upper bounds all the way up to 22 kilohertz, which is cool, because I do find there is like an air pressure difference just having that extra frequency content there, even if you can't really hear it. But unfortunately, this 5-inch monitor only goes down to 56 hertz, and the larger speakers go down to about 35, 36 hertz. So if you want to cover, the extra few frequencies there, you're going to have to add a subwoofer, and that's going to obviously add cost, complexity to your setup, and it's stuff that personally I don't want to even have to think about messing with. For the kind of music I make, that extremely low-end content generally isn't a problem, and the roll-off is such that you can still hear elements of it without it being as upfront and center as it should be if it were a completely flat response. But if you're making really bass-heavy electronic or dance music or something, that might be a problem for you. For pure entertainment purposes, yes, I prefer to have a subwoofer. I have it on my TV home theater setup. But for, again, the kind of music I make, it's not something I find to be problematic, but it is something you might want to consider if you're looking at, say, 3 to 5-inch monitors that don't go all the way down to that sub territory. You might end up saving some money in the long run if you just upgrade to 8 to 10-inch monitors from the beginning. The second half of that FR equation, flat response, can again be a problematic aspect for these studio reference monitors. Here I have a frequency response chart taken from online of the same kind of speakers I'm using here, the Aris E8s. These aren't exactly my speaker responses, but they should be fairly close. And the first thing you'll notice is both the speakers act a little differently. So we can't really talk about separate brands or separate SKUs because no two speakers are going to sound exactly the same, just like we run into with guitar speakers. So they both generally follow the same kind of curve, but on one, there's kind of big notches taken out of some core frequencies. There's one where, it peaks right around 600-700 hertz. So it's going to sound kind of more vocal and honky there. But in general, neither of these speakers fluctuate more than half a decibel to a decibel over large swaths of the frequency spectrum. And that's kind of what you're looking for in flat response. For this examples, we're looking at deviations of about 5 decibels from the average response. And that's not going to completely change the core voicing of the speaker solution you're listening to, but it is something to consider because none of these speakers out of the box are going to be perfect. That's why companies like SonarWorks exist to try to combat some of these things. But even if you had the perfect speaker solution, let's say you win the manufacturing lottery and you get a pair of monitors that sound absolutely perfect, completely flat, you have a subwoofer to make up for that sub content, it will still not be 100% correct because speakers interact with the space you're listening in. Whether it be a room like this, which has a lot of short reflections because there's no point in me padding a room that I likely won't be in another year, or you're listening through a perfectly treated studio, these monitors will sound different. And so that's why it's kind of hard to talk about, well, this one's always the best solution, because it sort of depends on where you're listening to them and even where you place them. So for instance, right up against the wall, you're actually going to amplify the bass content a lot more than if it were right in the middle of the room and on independent speaker stands. It's actually why I use isolation pads, which I need to get bigger ones for these now, to keep the vibration down on the desk, not only for mechanical annoyances, but to not affect the sound as much. And even setting your monitors up closer or further apart or pointing them differently, especially on like a vertical axis compared to your ears, can make them sound completely different. For example, you probably already noticed that these monitors aren't just one speaker. They have a main driver for the low end, and then a tweeter for the high frequencies, generally covering between like 2500 to 3000 hertz and up. And so you're supposed to set with these things with the tweeter pointing right at your ear. But if you're like me and you change your chair height throughout the day, depending on what you're feeling at the time, then it can kind of sound different. You get different phasing issues. And that's why you kind of have to be really careful where you set these things up, whether it be on a shelf or individual speaker stands. Fortunately for us, most of these speaker manufacturers realize that their audience is not going to have a perfectly treated studio to listen to their products in, so they usually include some sort of feature set to help combat that. For instance, this has an acoustic space control. You can leave it flat or roll off up to -4 dB in some of that low frequency response. That way, if you do set it right up against a wall like this, it'll help combat some of that resonance and make it sound more neutral. The Aris E8s do a particularly good job because they have a similar control that dials lower, and I think it even covers a larger frequency spectrum, but they also have mid and high controls as well. It's not something that you should abuse to make them sound better or more hi-fi. Remember, these are tools. You want them to sound flat and reliable. So no matter what you do, set them up in a way that even if they're not perfectly flat or full range, and they're probably not going to be, at least make them to where you know these speakers, you trust their response, and that when you listen to one of your songs and compare it to a reference mix, they sound ultimately within the same ballpark. A couple other considerations that might seem so obvious you might not think about it. Are these speakers powered? Up until now, I've been talking about all these things that are all-in-one amp and speaker solutions, but some older speakers, and even some new today, don't have integrated amplifiers. So now you need to choose your preference of amp that is FR as well, and then kind of compounds the issue. What is the input-output situation? You know, does it have XLR, TRS balanced inputs? Is it just a regular TS? Can it take RCA or even just base speaker cables if that's what you're looking for? It's all going to come down to your setup. Most of the time, though, I find that these budget end monitors generally are only going to have, you know, your typical XLR or TRS connector. So if you're looking for something with a little bit more flexibility, you're probably going to have to break out another $100 or so for each one. Lastly, but equally importantly, how loud do these speakers get? Well, the simple answer for me is loud enough, because both of these 5-inch audio speakers and the Aris E8s behind me go well over 100 decibels, and sound pressure level, I think that's around 108, this like 103, 105. It's uncomfortable no matter what metric you're using to measure it, so I keep them well below max volume. The better question is, do they still sound good at that volume, or the speakers distorting, or are they just kind of nasty and shrill? I do find larger speakers tend to handle higher volumes. It's not always the case, but within, you know, comparing the same brand or the same line of speakers, that generally is a rule of thumb. Though again, listen for yourself, demo as many of these things as you can before you ultimately decide what to go after. So that's kind of a bunch of things to keep in the back of your head if you're shopping around or considering upgrading your existing speaker system. To help hopefully ground some of these theoretical talking points, I wanted to at least anecdotally go over the process that helped inspire this video to begin with, which was upgrading these M-Audio BX5s to the PreSonus Aris E8s behind me. Kind of talk about the problems that I was getting increasingly frustrated with this speaker, and some of the solutions I found in the PreSonus Aris E8s, why they aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but will help me make more reliable, better music at the end of the day. And I'll give some very unscientific comparisons between the two that, you know, are not going to be representative of these two products as a whole. And even the testing methodology itself is quite flawed, but it will, at least in an exaggerated way, reveal some of the things that I was encountering, and why I'm very happy with the solution I arrived at. So I've had these BX5s for going on just shy of 5 years now. You've seen these in the background of practically every video I've ever made, and I've been relatively happy with them. In terms of entertainment value, definitely got my money's worth out of them, because I've played dozens of games and watched hundreds, if not thousands of hours of YouTube through them. Watched quite a few movies and shows, and you know, they sound hi-fi and much larger than you would expect out of a package than something like this. So for that alone, you know, the measly $80 or so for each speaker I paid, definitely worth it. But for the music creation side of things, I kept running into a consistent set of problems that ultimately, you know, drove me to look for an upgrade. And this was really personified by the recent release of my EP, Children of the Stars, where the low end was such that I would keep overcompensating for sub. So, you know, right around the 75 to 50 hertz region where this is starting to roll off, I would always crank that up too much. And then when you listen on other speaker systems, it would just be blown out. Consequently, the next kind of range of frequencies there in that 100 to like 150 hertz, these speakers tend to over-exaggerate, or at least by comparison, they sound over-exaggerated. So I would like tend to really highly compress those or scoop them out, and then it would sound kind of, you know, thin in that region. I even found some of the mids to be a little iffy. I'm not sure if it's because of the, you know, the phasing or just because I didn't have them, you know, set up properly, or at least to the specifications of the manufacturer. But either way, they could be a little finicky if you're not just soloing an instrument. And then even the high end could be a little brittle at times, but that was far from the biggest problem. It was really in that low and low mid response that eventually I just could not stand anymore. And frankly, it just doesn't feel like a whole lot of air is moving with these, even when you're really cranking them up. And I feel like it loses definition because of that. And as you'll hear, even a little bit of stereo imaging. It's one of those things where you have an instrument panned far left, and even if it's solo, like you're just listening to that left speaker, it doesn't sound like it's panned that far. Whether it be reflections or because the speaker itself is just, you know, smaller. I never felt like I had this, you know, huge wraparound sense that you get out of headphones or another quality stereo system. So I was hoping to resolve that, and frankly, I think these do an amazing job to go over all of those problems. So I'll let you listen first to kind of, again, a very imperfect comparison. I'm going to point two condenser mics to the speakers right at the tweeter. I'll have them set up here, and you'll be able to hear basically the exact trajectory that my ears would be if sitting here aligned with the tweeters, where they would be. I've got them set up for the acoustic controls and everything to the settings I actually use them for. And yeah, this is not going to be a perfect representation. Microphones do not pick up sounds like human ears do, but at least you'll be able to compare them in the same scenario, and you'll be able to hear some of the things that made me want to ultimately move on from these. Upon first reviewing those results, I honestly thought I'd butchered something with that test because the differences are just astounding. I thought maybe I'd summed a mic to mono or, had played back the file wrong. But as it turns out, after a couple of retakes, it was completely right. Now, that test unfairly makes these sound a lot worse than they actually are, which is unfortunate, but it does exaggerate the right things in the sense that I was hearing those stereo imaging differences. I was hearing that bass response difference, even though, microphones don't do a perfect job at showing that, especially in the far field or kind of mid field here. And ultimately, I'm shooting a file through a speaker and then a microphone, and then YouTube's compressing it, and then it's going to your speaker, which is likely not FR either. So you've got like, what, 4 layers of filters? You're not hearing what these actually sound like. But in this comparison, at the very least, it does show a couple big changes. First things first, the stereo imaging on these are absolutely insane compared to this. And I don't know if it's because of the phase correlation between the tweeter and driver or what. I have them set up exactly the same otherwise, but the E8 sounded so much wider and fuller in general. I'm not sure if it's because of these bass ports that are facing you, or the larger speakers are just moving more air and there's less opportunity for deconstructive interference the way they're set up. I don't know. The end result for me, though, is that I can make more accurate decisions on, panning something. 50 to 70% left sounds actually like 50 to 70% left without having to put on headphones like I kind of had to before. And the rest of the frequency range just sounds like there's like 10 drivers playing little chunks, because it does sound that separated. It does sound that articulate, whereas this was kind of, people use muddy, but I would describe it as the lines between where one note began, one note ended, or where one instrument sits and the other one sits, kind of blurred. And of course you want glue in your mix, but even the most separated of mixes still sounded kind of glued together with these, and that's not the case here. Finally, for an unintended side effect as a guitar player, I find these to be so much more enjoyable to play amp modelers through. With the BX5s, I would basically turn them on as background rumble and feedback machines, and then play through headphones to, get the majority of the tone shaping. But with these, they've got enough air moving, they're fat enough, there's that guitar speaker juice kind of feeling that I feel like I'm playing through a quality designed for guitar FR system, and almost like a real speaker cabinet. It's not exactly the same thing because 8-inch versus 12-inch, but it is close enough, and I find it enjoyable enough to just jam through, and I especially feel they're good enough to dial in tones and be confident for a mix. So all that combined, just these are so much better for my workflow. And I can't scientifically say, well, just get an 8-inch monitor, just, go to your budget limit and pick out the one that is the largest and go with that. It's never that simple. But what I can say is, compared to what my ears are kind of looking for a flat-ish monitor, and compared to the material that I'm working with, these are a very great fit. And if they can sound good in this room, then they'll probably sound great in yours. So I'm looking forward to hopefully having them in something that's, a little more centered and not as slap back echo as this place is. But overall, I'm very happy with the measly like $250 I spent on all this combined. And if you're feeling like your setup is lackluster, I would look at quality studio monitors before you do anything else. It is, again, all a balancing act. But at this point, I feel it's an easy recommendation to spend as much, if not more, on those than you are on something like your audio interface. Just my 2 cents. So with all that, hopefully this was useful in some way, and definitely be seeing these from now on, assuming they don't, get immediately replaced after the next EP I'm working on. But so far, I think these are keepers. So any other questions, please leave them down below. I'm not an expert on monitors by any means, but if I can answer it, I'll let you know. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye.